Well, let's start. Even though most of the people who are here are, in fact, we are Spanish speakers, as we have organized the meeting in English, we will do that, no? Because this is what I want to say. We'll see in the future if we repeat this event in English or we focus in the Spanish, that it's our language. But we have tried this meeting to say how it will, no? So we have now our friend and researcher Jim Beauregard that I am going to read. I have one of his books here, even though you can read it in the contrary way, so it's a bit complicated. But here I have a brief CV. He's a clinical neuropsychologist specializing in geriatric neuropsychology. He works as a clinician in a neuropsychiatric practice and also teaches at graduate level in the areas of biological basis of behavior, ethics, aging, and educational neuroscience. He's a member of the International Neuroethics Society and the International Conference on Persons and member of the Spanish Association of Personalism. Jim and I have been working together for a lot of years, so it's a pleasure to present a friend and a worker in bioethics from the personalist point of view. He also is very interested in the integral personalism, and in fact, this book is very based in the idea not only of personalism but also of integral personalism. And then the idea of this session that is is integrated in the Seminario of Personalismo Integral, just right because Professor Tim Beauregard is working from this perspective. Is not only working from the is not only using personalism in general, but specifically integral personalism. So that's the meaning of placing them in this seminary. He's working not precisely in the foundations of integral personalism, but in the applications of integral personalism. As in this case, one thing is the application in bioethics. In bioethics, we know that there is already the personalist bioethics done by Sgrecha, but Professor Jim Beauregard is working in a specific field that is neuroethics personalism. No? So the idea for this conference is that he explain us in more or less in 45 minutes, 50 minutes or 1 hour more or less, that he explains to us what is the general idea of the work he's doing in this field from this personalistic perspective. He has explained already that in many places, even in the Vatican, in 6 months ago, something like that, no? But in general, he's working in this field for a long time, no? So I give the word to Professor Jim Beauregard so that you can start explaining. Are you going to use a PowerPoint, Jim?
Yes, and
so
there is a copy of
okay, you can that's
okay. And I have sent a copy of my slides in Spanish. If we could post those in chat or some other way, if anyone wants to look at them as I go through this. So welcome everyone, and welcome to this seminar on personalism. Today, as Juan Manuel said, we are going to look at it.
the PowerPoint, Jim. Could you expand?
It's okay. We can see it.
Okay.
Is it? Okay. Okay. So today we are going to talk about an application of personalism in what may not be a familiar field to many of you, and that is neuroethics, the ethics of neuroscience. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how personalism works in that area. I will say a little bit about what neuroethics is, and then how neuroethics can be informed by the philosophy of personalism, an area I think where personalism is desperately needed. I will talk about the structure of such a neuroethics, and then talk about a neuroethics that is centered in the nature of the human person. So rather than talking about technology, as is usually the case in neuroethics articles, it's important, I think, to think about neuroethics in light first of persons. So the beginning of the life of persons, persons who are injured, persons at the end of their life, persons and the issue of cognitive enhancement, persons in the courtroom and in forensic settings. And also there is an emerging debate on neuro rights, neuroderechos. And we'll end by talking about neuroscience, neuroethics, and religion, a topic that has received very little attention, but is beginning to. So this is our plan for today. In terms of what neuroethics is, there are several definitions that are out there. The International Neuroethics Society says it is a field that studies the implications of neuroscience for human self-understanding, ethics, and policy. The Oxford Neuroethics has a similar definition, and the Mexican Neuroethics Society, I think, has a very good definition. Neuroethics is the ethics of neuroscience. It addresses ethical, legal, social, and cultural issues and concerns generated by the development and use of neuroscience and neurotechnology. So the question is, how do all of these things apply to human beings, and how can they be used safely with human beings? Also, what are the implications of new technology for persons? These are some of the areas that neuroethics thinks about. Enhancement, manipulation or alternation of free will, personal identity, and personality. That is a much debated area. And as we'll see later, oftentimes this literature plows forward with technology, but does not stop to talk about what does free will mean? What is identity? Criminal liability, children and adolescents, developmental neuroscience, justice, and a variety of other issues, all of which neuroscience touches on really the whole human lifespan. My own work in this area has resulted in 2 books that I would call generally Personalist Neuroethics, looking at these various areas and how personalism specifically could impact thinking in neuroscience. The first 2 are published. The third is the one that I am working on right now, and I will say a little bit about that at the end. Bioethics can be in a more secular vein. It can also be in a religious vein. There are both of those. There are Catholic hospitals all over the earth, and they often have specific religious directives about what should or should not be done. And I think there is a fruitful dialogue to be started between faith and reason as it appears in neuroethics. So first of all, some brief history. Neuroethics is brand new. The first conference on neuroethics was held in only 2002. You know, those of you who like me are Catholic know we have a tradition that goes back about 3,000 years. So this is not even a long weekend in the life of the church. It's a brand new discipline. People are just beginning to write about it, think about it. And so far, most of the literature, and there are thousands of articles now in the clinical literature, the peer-reviewed literature, are being written by neuroscientists. And that is an important point to make, because one thing that it means is that the literature is being written by people who are neuroscientists, so they have a strong background in neuroscience, but little to no background in philosophy. That's a problem, a big problem, when you want to address ethical issues in neuroscience. I have argued in my work and articles that neuroethics is not a scientific discipline in neuroscience, but rather it is a philosophical discipline within the science of ethics. Ethics precedes neuroscience, as John Paul II has said, that ethics precedes other things when we think about persons. So it's being written by people in other disciplines as well, neurologists, psychiatrists, bioethicists, and some by philosophers, but in a fairly limited way. What this means is that there is an underlying worldview for neuroethics that is powerful, but also problematic. Its underlying worldview is a worldview of science that developed historically from physics to chemistry to biology. So when we think about neuroscience, these are the types of things we're thinking about. Looking at the human brain, how it works, what its connections are, and sometimes problematically, neuroscientists will step beyond the boundaries of biology, which is essentially what neuroscience is, the biology of the brain, and start making big and sometimes unwarranted claims about persons based on biology alone. Underlying that worldview, classically, is materialism. If you look back to physics, the world is the cosmos are physical and therefore can be studied physically in terms of cause and effect. It tends to be a deterministic vision. And within neuroscience, functionalism and reductionalism are there as a constant subtest. So the question of the human brain becomes, how does it function? And that question can become linked with whether or not someone is a person. So there is a risk in neuroscience of reducing the person to brain function. And this is what you get, saying that the human brain is the human person, forgetting that there is something attached to this, namely the rest of us. So what happens when this kind of vision reigns? If brain function is equated with the person, then if someone does not have brain function, the logical conclusion of that is there is no person present. This has major implications for the beginning of life, life in utero, beginning of life, young life, injured life, and people as they are dying. How did this happen? There was a personalist philosopher from Scotland named John McMurray who has characterized the development of science and the history of philosophy as walking hand in hand, and he used the word field, ambito, to talk about how science developed. First in physics, which operates on a mechanical model, cause and effect. Along later came chemistry and then biology, which he referred to the field of the organic, the field of the study of living things, where the paradigm is still deterministic, but it changes from cause and effect to stimulus and response. How does an organism respond to its environment? The 20th century saw the rise of the field of the personal and the development of personalist thought. Of course, those of you who are familiar with personalism know that it can trace roots back into the ancient world of both East and West. But the personalism we're talking about today had its origins in the 20th and now 21st centuries. It's not a deterministic vision, not a materialist vision. It takes the whole person into account. So it's the only aspect of that scientific vision that allows for things like free will, conscience, and many other specifically human activities. Science and philosophy move in this cross-time, bottom-up kind of model. Personalism, on the other hand, moves from the top down. If we think about what it means to be a person, we think about all aspects of the person, the physical, the psychological, the spiritual. If you take away what is specific to persons, you get the organism, the field of the organic. If in the field of the organic you take away life, then you have matter, the field of the mechanical. Much of the way that neuroscience looks at human persons is from the field of the mechanical and the field of the organic, which in and of themselves, from a bottom-up approach, are not capable of conceiving of us as persons. So as I looked at this field and found myself increasingly dissatisfied with it, I looked to personalism to say there are answers here that need to be brought into discussion with the field, because this is the only way we're going to have a full accounting of persons and a full ethical vision about neuroscience. Personalism has numerous definitions. I stole this one from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. In a nutshell, what is personalism? It is a philosophy that begins with the human person, that is centered in the person, and that moves outward from there. That may sound fairly obvious, but if we look at the history of philosophy, up until the beginning of the modern era, much of philosophy was the philosophy not of persons, but of being, metaphysics, and persons were looked at in that context. It's well known that Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, looked at the Thomistic tradition and saw things that were missing there that needed to be supplemented. And his answer to that was to bring phenomenology into dialogue with Thomism to create a synthesis capable of conceiving of and talking about the whole person. There are many personalist philosophers out there. Some of these are probably folks that you are familiar with. People writing from that perspective of beginning with the human person and with the human person adequately conceived. So not just matter, not just organism, but as persons. The two personalists probably best known across the world for the 20th and 21st century are Martin Luther King Jr., who studied at Boston University when it was a center of Anglo-American personalism in the 1930s and 40s, and Karol Wojtyła, John Paul II, who was trained as a Thomist, came into contact with Shaler's work and worked at the integration of those two fields, a project that Edith Stein was also interested in. So there are two Roman Catholic saints looking to integrate the best of both traditions in a modern understanding of what it means to be a person. There are, because it's had a long development, many currents within personalism. Communitarian personalism, dialogical, in the work of people like Martin Buber, Anglo-American personalism, which really arises from the idealist tradition in philosophy. England and America have adopted those, taken ultimately from Germany. There is a realist phenomenological personalism that's grown out of the work of Husserl's first generation of followers, Edith Stein, Dietrich von Hildebrand, Roman Ingarden, and others. Thomistic personalism that moves out of Thomism, and lastly, integral personalism, Juan Manuel's thought, and we have him right here to comment if I get it wrong. So several books of his have been translated into English, an introduction to personalism, which gives the history of the discipline and lays out what integral personalism is, and also personalist anthropology, reflection on the human person in all aspects. I have found his model of the person very useful in talking about neuroscience and neuroethics, and this is that model in brief. It conceives of the person in a variety of ways: the corporeal, the psychological, and the spiritual. And for any English speakers with us, the term spiritual is used here as a philosophical technical term. The German word Geist can be translated as either mind or spirit. The spiritual, in this sense, refers to all of those specifically human functions that really don't exist anywhere else in the universe: love, happiness, aesthetics, freedom and free will, intelligence at a human level. So the human person is here conceived as having affectivity, dynamism, and freedom and knowledge operating at all the different levels of the body. This has a whole variety of interesting applications, one of which I think is in education. I have taught courses in educational neuroscience, and one of the assignments I give my students is take this model and do a lesson plan and talk about how you would educate each aspect, each of these 9 aspects of the person. Build that in and see how you would teach something so that you appeal to each of these 9 aspects or domains of personhood. They find it a very interesting assignment. This is a more recent model. It constantly reminds us that all of these are aspects of the person, and they're not to be separated from one another. Now, we can think about them separately, but every aspect of the person impacts every other aspect of the person. Think about the level of the body. Manuel has commented in one of his works that to touch the body is to touch the person. Everything resonates with everything else. So a person is a unified whole that can be understood in many different aspects. So when I talk about neuroethics, thinking through the ethical issues that arise in neuroscience, I look at it from a different perspective, beginning with persons. And that, practically speaking, means beginning with a robust, sound philosophical anthropology, which integral personalism provides. From there, moving to the world of ethics, from there to bioethics, and then finally to neuroethics. So there's a clear progression that ensures throughout that the whole person, not just the brain and brain function, is taken into account when you look at all the varieties of neurotechnology that are out there in the world. Oftentimes in the literature, what you see is neuroscientists talking about technology, and then sometimes ethical issues are added briefly at the end to say, oh yes, we must think about ethics. I've argued that that's the wrong place to begin. We need to begin with persons and stay centered in a person adequately conceived when we talk about neurotechnology. And by the term neurotechnology, I mean all the machines and things that are used, brain-computer interfaces and things like that, but also all the medications that have been developed for neuropsychiatric treatment. But in each of these cases, what I've argued is any thinking about neuroethics and neuroscience ought to begin with persons. And so I've developed this taxonomy, this sort of structure of neuroethics to keep it centered in the person. So instead of talking about specific technologies, what I've argued is we should talk about neuroethics at the beginning of life, at any point in life where a person is injured, at the point where a person is dying, issues around the cognitive enhancement of persons, and in terms of individual issues, but then also a social neuroethics, because much of what happens in medicine and other areas is in fact a social activity. And when any one of us goes to a doctor's office, it's not just my primary care doctor that I see. I see the receptionist, the nurse, the doctor. There's lots of medical equipment there. It's a social creation that I am in the midst of that pulls in many different areas of technology and many different persons, all of which have ethical implications. So I've written also about neuroethics in government, public policy about neuroethics, justice, and forensics. This raises serious issues about things like the use of neuroimaging technology in the courtroom, whether or not that should be done. Neuroethics, national security, and warfare. There's been a lot of research in neuroscience done on helping to heal soldiers wounded on the battlefield, but the flip side of the coin is there are also neurotoxins that can be used as weapons. What should be done about that? Neuroethics also thinks about the media. How do people perceive all those colorful pictures they see in the media about neuroimages and other technologies? Do they really understand what's going on? And do they really understand what claims can or cannot be made from a picture of the brain? I've written some about the teaching of neuroethics, people learning about it, and then also neuroethics and religion, which I'll get to at the beginning. I want to tell you a brief story. I was at the International Neuroethics Society just a couple of months ago. It was held in Baltimore, Maryland this year. It will be in Munich next year. One of the presentations was on neuro rights. Within the world of neuroscience, if you want something to have legitimacy, you tack the word neuro onto the front of it. So there was talk about neuro law and neuro rights, and even, believe it or not, neurophenomenology. Looking at experiences the persons have. It's phenomenology with the word neuro tacked on. I tried not to laugh when they said it, but it's a real thing in the field. There was a talk on neuro rights and neuro law, a panel discussion, and all the members of the panel, themselves neuroscientists and neuroethicists, argued that human rights had to be the foundation of neuro rights. So we have a human rights tradition I suspect all of us are familiar with. They talked about this for about an hour and a half. Human rights must be the foundation of neuro rights. At the end of that talk, I raised my hand and said, what are the foundations for human rights? There was a long silence. And then one member of the panel said, well, maybe something about protecting cognitive privacy. What I was getting at was there is a long tradition within human rights about human dignity as the foundation of neuro rights. The word dignity was not spoken in a 4-day conference. No one was thinking about it. And it's something I think is very important for neuroethics to think about, the dignity of the human person in the face of new technologies, new ways of thinking about persons, but it was absent there. So let's look a little bit for a little while at some of the specific issues that come up if we look at neuroethics from the perspective of persons. Neuroethics at the beginning of life, this is one of the most fundamental questions. What constitutes a person? At what point in your life are you a person? What happens when there are developmental issues? What is to be done about embryonic stem cell research? And also about the issue of prenatal diagnosis. I have a colleague of mine who's writing a bioethics paper on a bioethics dissertation on catastrophic prenatal diagnoses. And what she has told me again and again from her work with women who are pregnant and given very serious prenatal diagnoses is that typically that conversation is paired with talking about having an abortion. You have a poor prenatal diagnosis, terminate the pregnancy. It's a very common thing across all of American medicine. And she's arguing that, no, this should not be so. It should not be done this way. Personhood can be thought about in different ways. And again, another place where personalism comes into the picture. There are different ways of looking at persons. One is that to say to be a human being is to be a person. Elias Bermeas has written an interesting dissertation in bioethics where he raises the issue of language and how we think about persons, how we talk about persons. He raises the question during it, said, what would happen if we talk not about embryos, but embryonic persons, not about a fetus, but about a fetal person, a neonatal person, an infant person. The way we talk about these things, there is a sense of linguistic battle that has been lost, but needs to be re-engaged in terms of the very way we talk about being a person. So one way to look at the person is to say a human being is a person from the moment of conception to natural death. And that means, practically speaking, that all the rights a person are entitled to are present from the beginning of life to the end. What happens in neuroscience, and has happened in other areas of society as well, is that the notion of person has been constricted to say that, okay, it's sometime after conception, you come to be considered a person. And it may also happen that at some time before the end of your life, you stop being a person. If you have a serious brain injury, if you have dementia. So the notion of personhood has effectively been shrunken, limited, so that there are periods before personhood, periods after personhood, and then person in the middle, but it is a status that is not equated with being human, but one that is attained and lost. We see it in debates around pregnancy in the beginning of life to say at what point does a person become a person and is therefore entitled to all the rights that accrue to persons? Is it at conception? Is it at implantation in the uterus? Is it when there is evidence of brain function? Is it at birth? Is it when someone reaches the age of reason? You know, the interesting thing about that is that each person who argues for one of those points argues it as if it were an objective truth, and yet no one agrees on when that point is. So from a personalist perspective, I think we can argue that we need to work from that top model and not the bottom one, that a person is a person, plain and simple, throughout their lives, and that person has dignity from the beginning of their life to the end that needs to be both reverenced and respected. What happens when injuries occurs? These are some of the issues that bioethics generally have talked about, neuroethics as well. Brain injury, brain death, a lot of debate going on about brain death now. And within Catholic bioethics, there's a significant debate happening about whether or not brain death can be equated with the death of a person. Some are arguing that yes, it can be. Others are saying no, that it isn't. That it requires, full cessation of cardiopulmonary and all biological activity. So there's a debate going on back and forth. What happens in disorders of consciousness? Some of the most amazing things being done in neurology now is reaching individuals who may be in a coma, but who still have some brain function, and creating situations in which they can communicate with the outside world, despite being in a minimally conscious state. Neuroprostheses. I met a gentleman, about 30 years old, at the International Neuroethics Society, who did a talk. He had a swimming accident at the age of 18, paralyzed from the waist, from the neck down, quadriplegia. I shook his hand after the meeting. He has a brain-computer interface that allows him to move normally. Basically, his brain was reconnected to his spinal cord through brain-computer interface, and he relearned how to move his body in that process. So some amazing things are being done. There are ways to treat neuropsychiatric conditions that may be invasive or not. Deep brain stimulation has been used in the treatment of epilepsy and Parkinson's disease. There are also non-invasive brain stimulation techniques, transcranial magnetic stimulation. This is a particularly problematic area because you can buy these devices on Amazon.com, do-it-yourself, homemade brain stimulation devices that are not FDA approved, not approved by any federal agency, but just sort of out there. That's a worrisome thing when the research is in its early stages and when you don't necessarily know what implications or what consequences that may have. Neuropsychiatric conditions across the lifespan. And we all know that in the debates around euthanasia, it wasn't just in cases of terminal illness with severe pain. Fairly soon in the process, psychiatric conditions were entered into the discussion, saying if someone has a severe neuropsychiatric disorder, should they be allowed to end their life? And lastly, addiction neuroethics. And what about the end of life? We all know the name Peter Singer in bioethics. Arguments have been made in a more utilitarian perspective of bioethics that after a certain point in the process of dementia, a person is no longer a person. And that if that is the case, it's acceptable to end their life. It raises that basic question about human dignity. It looks at functionalism as a definition of person. When you fall below a certain level of brain functioning, you're no longer considered a person. However, different neuroethicists will name different points in the process to say, above this, you're a person, below this, you're not. And a critical question that has been raised in end-of-life care in these kinds of situations is that people will often make healthcare power of attorneys, giving directions, medical directions, and a living will about what kind of treatment they want at the end of their life if they're not able to make decisions themselves. Neuroethics has raised the question, well, if someone is below a certain level of cognitive functioning, can their wishes be overridden and their life ended if the person said, no, I want ongoing medical care, even if I'm at a certain point in the dementing process? So there's a debate going on about that, about whether euthanasia is acceptable, whether it can be imposed on a person, even if they have said otherwise. Is that person still a person? And is there a point that comes when that person is no longer a person? So the question of personhood really does lie at the heart of many neuroethical debates. Then there is the issue of enhancement. cognitive enhancement, moral enhancement, attention enhancement. This is a fraught field where there is really limited demonstration of efficacy, but widespread use. The statistics here in the United States are, for example, about 6% of the population has attention deficit disorder. In the college setting, about 16% of the population uses medications for attention deficit disorder during exam week, believing that it will give them an edge in studying. Now, enhancement has been around for a long time. In the 1700s, coffee was introduced to Europe, and the coffee houses sprung up everywhere. And J.S. Bach wrote his coffee cantata in light of this. And Lieschen is arguing with her poor father Schlendrian, saying, "Father, don't make me give up coffee. If I don't have coffee, I will live in misery." But the notion of enhancing aspects of our cognition has been around for a long time. The question becomes, though, there are medications that are created for the purpose of treating medical conditions. What happens when those medications are used to people who don't have those conditions? Can they actually enhance some aspect of functioning? It raises deep philosophical questions like, what is health? What is illness? What are we actually enhancing if enhancement is happening? Can cognition be enhanced? Memory, attention? Can morality be enhanced? And this is also a fundamental aspect of transhumanism, which raises serious ethical questions, again, about the very nature of persons. So when we look at the issue of enhancement, people are sort of plowing ahead with the assumption that these are smart pills. They make you smarter. There really is very little evidence to demonstrate, if a college student takes Adderall or another medication during exam week, do they do better on their exams? No. They may have a little buzz. They may be a little more alert, but it doesn't replace the hard work of studying all semester. It's people looking for a quick fix. When we look at enhancement, there really is very little evidence that it works. Also, all of these medications have side effects, some of them potentially serious, may cause changes in the brain that are irreversible, and de facto, only people who have money can afford to get a hold of these things to use them for things like exam week. It also raises the question of, here's an example. There is a school system in a particular city where the students are underperforming. Should those students be given cognitive enhancers to try to improve their performance? And if so, can that be done with or without their or their parents' consent? In the workplace, the same kinds of issues arise. In the military, these kinds of issues arise. If there is enhancement that works, can it be essentially imposed on a person, or will the person de facto embrace some aspect of enhancement to keep up with the rest in order to get things like promotions, longevity in a position? So there are a lot of ethical questions that extend far beyond the actual use of a pill. Transhumanism touches on these issues as well, and the very term itself is philosophically problematic. Transhumanism, going beyond what exactly? We hear talk about post-human conditions, Nick Bostrom and folks like that. There's little realization, it seems to me, in this field that all these things they're talking about are things being done to persons, most often things that affect that person only and are not passed on to the next generations. Genetic technologies change that picture, but it also raises possibilities in the domain of eugenics, designer babies. If you have the ability to make certain genetic choices about your children, should that or should that not be done? But the notion of transhumanism is one that's fraught with all kinds of philosophical problems. What is it to be human? That question is usually not answered directly. And then what does it mean to move beyond that? And is it really a moving beyond it? The hot topic now is artificial intelligence, which has been around for a long time. If any of you, for example, drive an automobile that has an automatic transmission, well, that's artificial intelligence. Your car has to know when to shift from a lower gear to a higher one or up and down. Basic things like that count under the grand umbrella of artificial intelligence. Machines that think, as it were, that do something on their own apart from us and adapt to some sort of situation. There was a long history from Alan Turing in the 1950s through the use of computer technology more recently. Any of you who use translation services or any kind of essentially computers are using some aspect of artificial intelligence, and there has begun to be a debate about how much of this should be or should not be used. What is it in the first place? It involves all of these areas: data science, deep learning, machine learning, and programs with the ability to learn and reason like humans. That's an interesting statement because computers don't have brains. They have hardware, they have programs put in them. And to what extent can those programs mimic human thought? It's a different kind of entity. And yet the comparison is made between computers and human beings, saying that both are intelligent, whether or not that is in fact the case. Many things go into artificial intelligence to do all of these types of things: machine learning, natural language processing, expert systems, but also prosthetics to help people with vision, with speech, with movement, those types of things. So there are many good uses going on, but underneath that, there is a frequently unspoken debate about what is the nature of the human person to whom all these types of things are being done. The question doesn't often get answered, and when it is raised in the first place, it's usually raised from a biological or purely physical perspective, from the level of the corporeal or the organic. Laws are being passed increasingly regulating AI, and many of these issues revolve around cognitive privacy and cognitive liberty. Brain-computer interfaces, the way they're typically designed is for a message to go from your brain into a computer system and then either into your body or onto a computer screen. People can think words and have them appear on a computer screen. For example, neuroethics has raised the question, well, what happens if that direction of travel can be changed? It's going from my brain out into the world. What happens if it can come from the world into my brain? Can thoughts or information be put into my brain? Also, when information from my brain goes out onto a computer, who owns that information? Who has access to it? What if the computer gets hacked? What happens to the privacy of my thoughts in my mind when some aspects of my mind are in a place other than inside my head? So it raises profound questions about privacy and individual liberty. This connects with this next area, neuroethics, justice, and forensics. Neuroscientists have often argued that there is no such thing as free will. We don't make free decisions. This goes back to the experiments of Benjamin Libet in the 1970s and 80s, in which he found that there's brain activity going on roughly 300 milliseconds before there's a conscious intention to act. He reasoned from that, okay, that means that our brain is making decisions outside of our awareness, beyond our awareness. And there's been a storm of controversy over that ever since then. Free will in those debates gets equated with a very simple task. When Libet did his experiments, people essentially were pushing a button on a computer. That process came to be equated with free will, which is a reality that we know as persons is far more complex than that. Criminal responsibility. Neuroscience has entered that debate as well. Picture a courtroom scene in which a defense attorney puts a neuroimaging picture up for the jury to see and says, you see this lesion in the person's brain here? This is the reason that he committed his crime. Therefore, he should not be found guilty. As if there were a direct correlation between a particular brain lesion and what the person did. Any competent neuroradiologist will tell you that that is utter nonsense. But when you see those types of things in the media, people who don't have a neuroscience background may well believe it, and juries may well believe it too. What that defense attorney doesn't want you to know is that there are probably several million other people across the planet who have that very same lesion in their brain who don't do criminal activities. Should neuroimaging be used in the courtroom? For that reason, the legal answer in many countries has been no, it should not, because the interpretation of neuroimages is a critical issue. A lesion in the brain does not automatically correlate with certain types of behavior. And also in this domain, what happens if a neurotechnology is developed? It doesn't exist yet. What happens if a neurotechnology develops that can somehow record thought, record what a person is thinking? This has been discussed in the issue of lie detection. When someone takes a lie detector test, up until recently, there were physiological measures, so galvanic skin response, vital signs that were correlated with whether or not someone was telling the truth. Arguments have been made that neuroimaging is a better technique to use to try to detect whether or not someone was lying. It doesn't really make much difference. And lie detection is a very difficult issue because much of what happens in a lie detection test has nothing to do with the technology. For example, no two lie detection tests are going to be the same. There's a factor in the questioning of a person who's taking a lie detector test called guilty knowledge. So you ask the person about things that only the person who committed the crime would have known. What that means is no two lie detection tests can be exactly alike. So how do you control for those types of things? How do you measure lie detection? People are arguing neuroimaging will do that, but it hasn't panned out. And the discipline has essentially stopped talking about this in recent years, realizing that it was more hype than reality. And then we come to the debate on neuro law and neuro rights. What kind of laws need to be passed to protect people from neurotechnology? How should it be regulated? John Paul II had written ethically, ethics precedes technology. It has to come first. We need to think about ethics from the moment technology is conceived, through its development, and through its use. Because one of the things that happens with technology is dual use. You can split the atom and create power plants. You can split the atom and build atomic bombs. A particular technology can have many different uses. You don't want to think about those things after it's happened. You want to think about them beforehand. The story I mentioned at the beginning, human rights ought to be the foundation for neuro rights, but what is the foundation for human rights? The lack of an answer to that question when I asked it points to essentially the fact that the people on the panel and most of the people, the 200 people in that conference, were thinking about technology, but not thinking about persons and not thinking about what is fundamental to being a person. What does it mean for a person to be unique, unrepeatable? What does it mean for a person to have dignity? Human rights from the end of World War II, the Universal Declaration in 1948, right through Dignitas Infinita, the congregation's dicastery, rather, document that was put out a few weeks ago, takes its basis in human dignity. So it's important that we think through what that issue is. What is human dignity, and how does that give birth to human rights? One issue that has happened in recent decades that people can become concerned about is the proliferation of rights. It seems like every time you turn around, there's some new right being articulated. Some of them probably should be, some of them maybe not. But when you stay at that level of rights, it's again failing to ask the question of persons. What does it mean to be a person? What does it mean for a person to have dignity? And how does that blossom into an understanding of human rights that can be the foundation for neuro rights, which essentially mean protecting people and protecting privacy in light of neurotechnology? So there is a neuro rights debate going on. Do we need new rights? Should new rights be articulated? Should the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights have an additional Bill of Rights added to it? Should we keep tacking on new rights? Or is what's there sufficient? And what is needed is new laws for the regulation of technology. Many of our laws were written without contemporary technology being taken into account, hasn't been conceived yet. Can current laws be adapted to include things like brain-computer interfaces, the storage of data, and things like that? Or does there need to be a new right articulated? The last area I want to touch on is neuroethics and religion. Bioethics, as I mentioned, can be secular or it can be religious. Both of those traditions have been around for a long time. Neuroscientists, I found, are either afraid of religion or hostile to it. We all know there's a history in that, going back to Galileo and probably well before, but John Paul II has made clear there is an appropriate dialogue between faith and reason, reason in this sense meaning science. What happens when neuroethics, the ethics of neuroscience, comes into contact with religious traditions? There's very little that's been done, but one excellent early book was by Neil Messer, a British neuroscientist and minister. He trained as neuroscientist and then became a Protestant minister later on. And so he published a book called Theological Neuroethics, Christian Ethics Meets the Science of the Human Brain. He's the first person I know of who has asked in any sort of structured or organized way questions about the ethics of neuroscience from the perspective of faith. He raises these 5 questions, and when we're thinking about technology, we're thinking about how technology gets used, he offers these questions from a theological perspective. Essentially, is the technology being used to serve persons, or are we pretending to be gods and looking to change what human beings are? Is this more an effort, a result of original sin, than an actual ethical contribution to science? What attitude does a new technology display toward the material world? Is our body an integral aspect of who we are, or is it an instrument that we use, something that's essentially seen as separate from us? What attitude does a new technology demonstrate toward our neighbor? Is it good news to the poor? When a new technology comes into being, how is it going to be available to people? When I was at that conference a couple months ago, someone raised their hand talking about neurotechnologies and things and said, is this just a first world problem? You know, we're developing all these wonderful new technologies, and will they have access to it in Indonesia, in sub-Saharan Africa, in parts of Asia, in South America, in poor parts of North America or Canada? Much of the debate is focused on technologies that are created in and exist in the first world. So there is a question, a deep question of justice to be raised. And what attitude does it display toward past failures? There are human problems that result from our history. Are those being overcome, or are they simply being repeated? So he is asking, I think, some very important fundamental questions about neurotechnology. I want to look at it from a Catholic perspective, because it's the perspective where I come from and a tradition I know. And I think there is a fruitful dialogue to be had between Catholic bioethics and neuroscience, neuroethics, neurotechnology. One also that begins from persons. Now, when we move into the religious or theological domain, the dignity of the human person comes from our creation in the image of God. It's a much more straightforward argument. Arguing for human dignity from a philosophical perspective is hard work. It's difficult work, but it can be done. It's easier in that we can go back to Genesis 1 from a religious perspective and say, well, let's make man in our own image and likeness, and that is the source of the dignity of the person. In contrast, a bioethicist named Ruth Macklin, back in 2003, argued in a 2-page editorial in the British Journal of Medicine that has now become famous that dignity is a useless concept in medical ethics and can be eliminated without any loss of content. She would simply do away with the term altogether. What did she say dignity came to mean? Well, first, she said it was too vague to be useful. And secondly, it can be replaced by the notion of respect for persons. I think there is more to the notion of dignity than is the case, but she made that argument and many people just sort of swallowed it whole. When we move from the perspective of faith, there are numerous resources available to us as we look at issues of neuroscience and neurotechnology. There are resources from scripture, Genesis 1 and 2, the prophets, the wisdom literature, the entire New Testament, and the tradition of moral theology, Vatican II, and various bioethical documents that the magisterium has produced. So there's a lot of stuff out there to create a dialogue between faith and reason here that I think needs to happen in terms of understanding and using technologies. Many countries have this. In the United States, the bishops have put out a set of ethical and religious directives for Catholic healthcare services. It governs ethical practice in Catholic hospitals in the United States. And it begins with the dignity of human life. The dignity of human life flows from the creation in the image of God, from redemption by Jesus Christ, and from our common destiny to share a life with God beyond all corruption. So Catholic healthcare must respect human dignity. There are specific directives within this that talk about the dignity of persons. The inherent dignity of the human person must be respected and protected regardless of status. There is a Personalist Bioethics already written and in practice. This massive tome, it's available in English and Spanish and Italian. It was written by Cardinal Elos Grecia. He argues from a personalist perspective. He is more a Thomistic personalist, but he has some very important points, I think, about how bioethics itself can be thought of from a personalist perspective. He argues for 4 fundamental principles for a personalist bioethic: the defense of the physical life of the person, respect for autonomy, freedom and responsibility, the principle of totality, and principles of sociality and subsidiarity. So it's the individual and the community that need to be taken into account in terms of healthcare. I have been working on developing a model from a personalist perspective, and again, growing out of Juan Manuel's work, to think about how do we bring this into a practical discussion about neuroethics and neurotechnology. The argument I made is that we need to begin with the notion of person, a person who is a complex, integral unity of body, psyche, spirit, affectivity, free will, knowledge, and that at the center of that is the dignity of the human person and the fundamental right to life. That, I think, is a starting point to argue from a Catholic perspective about neuroethics. So the general, it's also important to have some practical principles when it comes to making neuroethical decisions on the ground. And these are the ones that have existed in Catholic bioethics now for decades to centuries. principle of integrity and totality for the body. That's the principle that essentially says an organ of the body can be sacrificed for the sake of the whole. So if someone has an organ that has become cancerous, it can be surgically removed for the purpose of saving the person's life. Right to life, stewardship of resources, respect for individual autonomy. The principle of double effect, I think, is going to become very important in neuroethics, which simply states that I do something and it has two effects, one good, one potentially evil. Can I go ahead with the good action when I know there will be negative consequences? It's been a constant in Catholic bioethical thinking for a very long time, and one I think that deserves to be introduced into neuroethics and discussed in a bit more detail. I'm going to give an example of that in just a couple of minutes. So I tried to sort of put it in a diagram to make it a little more usable. At the center of a bioethics from a religious perspective, the person and the dignity of that person across their whole lifespan, encompassing those four principles that Neuroética has given us, but also the various practical principles that can be brought into play in many different situations. Now, how do you know which principle to use? This is where the virtue of prudence comes into play. In a given situation, what are the principles that arise that I need to take into consideration in this particular kind of situation? Let me give one example of that. There is a huge amount of research being done right now on the use of psychedelic drugs, recreational drugs from the 1960s, asking if they have a potential use as medications. There are typically classifications of medications in many countries. What can be prescribed, what can be not, but there's often a class of medications to say, this doesn't have any medical benefits, so it's not to be prescribed for anything. This is not, aspirin, a basic, cough medicine, things like that. But psychedelics, LSD, psilocybin, mushroom, mescaline, are usually classed in this category. However, there is a pretty consistent body of research emerging indicating that these have potential for use as psychiatric medications. Should that be pursued? There are classic psychedelics, psilocybin, and mushrooms, LSD, developed earlier in the century, but it was a major player in the 1960s, mescaline, DMT found in ayahuasca, but also non-classic psychedelics, newer things that have been used. Can they be used as medications? So they have any potential to help? And how might a personalist neuroethics look at this whole issue? Should we, first of all, just look back at the 1960s and disastrous aspects of that and say, no, just get rid of this stuff. We don't want to see it ever again. Or could they, in fact, have some potential use beyond what's available now for neuropsychiatric medications? And psychedelics have been around for a long time. They have a long history of use in religious ceremonies. There is a widespread psychedelic tourism that goes on across the world, people traveling to countries where they're more available to use. So what is a neuroethicist to do? What I'm arguing essentially is that we need to do two things here. One, put away the baggage from the 1960s, and two, follow the science. Each of these have risk factors. They can cause harm in people who are already psychotic or who predisposed to being psychotic. You would not give this to someone who has schizophrenia, for instance. They can cause dangerous behaviors in some people. They can cause physical changes in the body. They can cause persisting perceptual changes that may not go away. And there is data to suggest that they're not, for the most part, addictive, but they have potential side effects. There are many active areas of investigation asking the question from an empirical point of view, can some of these substances be used to treat smoking cessation, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, a variety of psychiatric conditions? At this stage, what mostly is in existence are pilot studies, small groups, where it has been found that these substances produce some positive effects with minimal side effect risk in people for whom other kinds of psychiatric medications have not been as helpful. One of the main areas being looked at is post-traumatic stress disorder and the use of some of these substances in terms of speeding up the treatment and recovery from PTSD. I'm going to just mention briefly a couple of studies that have been done over the past decade or so. Cancer and existential distress, improvements in depression or anxiety, improvement in anxiety symptoms and depression symptoms. These are fairly short-term studies where there is oftentimes just one episode of use of a psychedelic followed by psychotherapy where people show more rapid improvement. Addiction recovery. Again, some early studies, again, small numbers, 20, 30, 40 people. That is a long way from a federal clinical drug trial, but that is the direction the research is being done. There's a lot of research going on in Switzerland currently and at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, about these things. And to their credit, they are approaching this from a scientific empirical perspective, and they are asking the question, what has to be done so that these substances, if they are proven to be effective, can make it through federal clinical trials and be approved as medications. So they have set a very high bar for the use of these to demonstrate, on the one hand, efficacy, and on the second, safety. Psilocybin and mushrooms have been one of the main objects of study and are being looked at in many of these kinds of issues: smoking cessation, depression and Alzheimer's, recovery from addictions, anorexia nervosa, post-traumatic stress disorder. So there's a lot being done. To their credit, the researchers who are doing it insist that it be paired with psychotherapy and that it be done under very controlled situations. If you're interested in hearing more about this, go to the Johns Hopkins Center for Psychedelic Research. They have quite a detailed description of how this process is done. When someone takes a psychedelic as part of a research study, there are two people with them in the room, and they remain with that person through the psychedelic experience to make sure that they're safe, make sure that they do okay with it. And that is immediately followed by a period of weeks to months of individual psychotherapy that's referred to typically as integrative therapy, talking about what that experience was. What the pilot studies are suggesting is that this is speeding up the treatment process for people with fairly severe psychiatric conditions, and also helping some folks, as for instance, folks with long-standing PTSD, for whom other methods of treatment, both medications and psychotherapy, have had little effect. So what should neuroethics be saying about this? It's on the horizon. The people doing the research are saying that within the next 5 years or less, they're going to be at a point where there is sufficient evidence to start federal clinical trials in various countries to say it's safe, we have some data to prove it's effective, let's do a large-scale clinical trial. From a neuroethics perspective, as personalists, we begin with the person. Here we have persons who are suffering severely, oftentimes persons for whom other psychiatric interventions have been either ineffective or limited efficacy. We have Segretti's principles kind of overriding the process, but also some specific principles to think about. Respect for autonomy. Double effect is a concept that comes into effect when we take any medication. There is benefit, there are potential side effects. That will need to be taken into account. Stewardship, who gets access to it? Common good, will it be helpful, broadly speaking, in society? Well, a society that has fewer people with post-traumatic stress disorder is probably going to be a much better society. So all these practical principles can come into play. The Catholic guidelines for hospitals don't talk directly about it because it's brand new, but there are things in those guidelines that can be useful. In particular, the person with mental or physical disabilities must be treated as a unique person of incomparable worth with the same right to life and to adequate health care as all other persons. This, I think, opens a door into evidence-based medicine for the use of these types of medications. Hospitals will promote medical research consistent with this mission of providing health care. Use of any new medication needs to be evidence-based. People putting the medications into clinical studies have to demonstrate both safety and effectiveness. It needs to not harm people. It needs to have an acceptable side effect profile. And it's not too burdensome for the person. And it needs to help do something that other medications may not be able to. The inherent dignity of the person is taken into account. Free and informed consent. People need to know what they're getting into when they do a drug study or anytime someone is being prescribed a medication. And the well-being of the whole person needs to be taken into account. Many of the Catholic directives deal with more physical aspects, surgeries, what can and what cannot be done, organ donation, variety of things. But it does take into account neuropsychiatric conditions. So what would a Catholic neuroethical perspective say about psychedelics? I'm going to frame this as an if-then question. If these criteria are met, then yes, they can be useful. Are they grounded in evidence-based medicine? Here in the United States, 1 or 2 states have already approved their use for treatment of things like post-traumatic stress disorder, essentially with no solid evidence base, no widespread clinical trials. That, I think, is a mistake. Evidence-based medicine. Can these substances as medications be shown to be safe for people to take in controlled situations? Can they be demonstrated to have clinical efficacy? Do they work? And particularly, do they work in psychiatric conditions where other methods of treatment have had limited or little to no efficacy? If someone has post-traumatic stress disorder and no type of treatment has helped them to get better, is this something that can be helpful to them? Are there solid clinical guidelines about who should or should not be taking such a medication? In what doses? Over what period of time? How should they be prescribed? Should psychotherapy be automatically included as part of the process? Are these substances regulated? Now, here in the United States, we have the Food and Drug Administration, which is responsible for overseeing medication. So in order for a medication to be available to be prescribed by a physician or the healthcare practitioner, it must be approved by the Food and Drug Administration. That means rigorous clinical trials to make sure that it is both safe and effective. And lastly, does it have a reasonable side effect profile in that it doesn't kill anyone? It doesn't cause such serious side effects that a person would simply not be able to take it. My thought as a neuroethicist would be that if these conditions can be demonstrated and met, then this can become available for use as a medication in the treatment of certain neuropsychiatric disorders that have been long resistant to other methods of treatment. Again, this process is centered in the person, kept in mind from beginning to end. It's the person who is often suffering phenomenally in every aspect of their being, physically, psychologically, spiritually, oftentimes with no remission from the available treatments. Is it reasonable to continue to look for new interventions to help people who in many cases have looked to be beyond help? Yes, absolutely. Looking for ways that are evidence-based to treat suffering. And if one of those methods has a history, has baggage, and has a lot of political thought connected to it, perhaps we need to put that aside and look at it simply as a medication that is helpful in ways that other things simply have not been. So I would argue as a neuroethicist that this should be pursued, not in a rush, not rushing to judgment, but waiting until there is solid evidence that it works, that it's safe. And that evidence is, in fact, probably only a few years away. It will either crash and burn and prove to be not useful, or it will prove to work, in which case I would argue that it should become available for physicians to prescribe appropriately with solid guidelines for treatment of human suffering that has shown itself to be unresponsive to other forms of treatment. That finishes up my presentation today. I think I want to thank everyone for joining us, and we perhaps have a little time now for questions.